introduction slide there. So thanks, Erin, for the introduction. And so I think that just wanted to say a few words about sort of how this study came about, and then the collaboration with Heather, which has been really fruitful and I think is a really wonderful example of how a collaboration between different sort of folks with different skills can be really so synergistic and helpful to lots of folks, I think. And then a little bit of sort of what we found. So I think that this really started with me in many ways becoming more and more familiar over the last decade, even over many years, about the importance of the sort of messaging we send to students about who does science and how they relate to science courses and how they engage with science courses. And of course, students are surrounded by messaging about who can do science, whether you're thinking about pop culture or the media or science classes themselves. The science classes that we teach send some message one way or another, whether it's intentional or not, about who can do science. And I think that the thing that really sort of resonated with me was becoming more and more familiar with the social science literature around concepts like stereotype threat, science identity, possible selves, belonging, and these other sort of phenomena, showing that this messaging is really important and really impactful, that it certainly impacts people's ability to feel a sense of belonging and sort of their sense of where they fit in with the class. But beyond that, which is really important in itself, it also, of course, directly affects learning. And so, the idea that you have to feel that you belong in a class and you can't be feeling subject to stereotype threat and some of these other issues to learn material. And so even at the most basic level of, if we care about our subjects, then we want people to be able to learn that and to be able to engage with that material and be able to succeed at the course. And I think that the other thing that really made me reflect on as well is my own identity in the classroom. And I think that this is something that's stuck with me very much ever since reading some of this literature, which is that I work in a really phenomenal group of students in a community college that don't necessarily share a lot of my identity characteristics, I think. So, here I'm this white, cisgendered man, heterosexual, able-bodied, non-veteran, non-first generation individual in my classroom full of folks that really don't match those characteristics. And that what I saw in the literature was that could matter, that mismatch could really matter a lot. And that had me concerned in many ways about sort of my role in that class. And something I still think about a lot is, to what extent is it appropriate that somebody like me is teaching in a community college environment, and what can I do to make sure that I'm not the only example of a scientist in that class that is sort of being presented. And so that led to scientist spotlights, and there's an example here, of course, which I don't expect folks to read through. I was just going to point out a few aspects of it. This is about Lawrence David, who's a Filipino-American microbiologist, and this was perhaps around one of my units on the immune system or the digestive system. It could fit in there as well. But there's a couple things that students would be doing. They'd be listening to Lawrence David in his own voice, talking a little bit about his story. And so that's that Story Collider link that's shown there, that they click here and listen to that. There's a transcript available. And then reading actually a piece of scientific literature that he produced, in this case a Nature article talking about some of his work. And I think some of the things that struck me about this was that, for one thing, there's a direct connection to course content. And so the little that we do see, I think, in terms of seeing diversity reflected in the classroom, it often is extra. It's sort of seen as this extra thing where it's like, okay, now we're going to do a diversity thing. And like, here's this diversity example. And it really seems kind of almost contrived and separate from the content. And I thought that it was very important for me to showcase equity, diversity, and inclusion as part of what's integrated into the content, into the curriculum. And so I thought that that was very important. And so in this case, students would be learning about course content that would be discussed in class and that would be part of, what they would have been studying anyway. So it's really, sort of helping to fulfill those goals. And the other thing that sort of is unique compared to other diversity-related things that I've encountered in the past is that there's a very specific reflection prompt about what does this tell us about the types of people that do science. And so, again, the few times I've seen diversity featured in classes before has often been like, okay, well, here's a picture on a screen or something of somebody who maybe represents a counter-stereotypical scientist, and aren't they cool or whatever, and then like move on to the next slide or something. And there's very little engagement with like, well, what did we really think about that? Like, what did that tell us about who does science? And so these prompts, I think, something that sort of doesn't always stand out to folks is that there's a constant, repetitive prompt to reflect on like, well, what really did this assignment tell you about who does science? And I think that for me, like the Lawrence David one actually was the first example that I tried, and the response from students was so overwhelming and so positive that I felt like I had to do this more often. And so then I started doing it almost weekly in class, and then that led me to reach out to folks like Heather, because I thought, wow, like there's really fascinating things happening in my class, and I wonder what's going on, and I wonder, what's the best way to investigate this. And so it's been a really productive collaboration with Heather ever since then to kind of work on this, and Heather's advisor at NC State, Mary Wire. And so just as a brief review for folks who maybe didn't get a chance to delve deeply into the paper, but one of our prompts, we used qualitative data for this study, and Heather could talk later about some of the quantitative follow-up we've done with quantitative items. But one of the prompts was this one about, based on what you know now, describe the types of people that do science and refer to specific scientists if possible. And we looked at this in a lot of different ways, students' responses. I thought that one way that's sometimes very impactful is to just show some examples in word clouds, because it gives a really quick view of sort of some of what the themes were. And so we did this at the beginning and end of course. And so here's an example of a word cloud showing the prevalence of various student themes from writing to this prompt at the beginning of course, and seeing, of course, in there probably what we might consider some stereotypes and some common predictions of what we might have about who does science. And then we collected the same evidence at the very last day of course, and then actually also 6 months later as a sort of follow-up longitudinal data point. And to save space, I'm just actually going to show you the 6 months later after the end of the course, just to show that longitudinal trend. This is from Scientist Spotlight students, the ones who are doing the intervention, and we see that there are some pretty obvious changes in the themes and the prevalence of those themes amongst what students were saying. And so again, this is sort of a visual representation of much of what we quantified in the paper and what we sort of did statistical tests on to see what changed. And then finally, given sort of where I started saying that, like, you know, a lot of the literature shows that this is not just important for some of the more affective elements like belonging, but for actually learning material, we were curious if the students in these courses compared to our control courses were perhaps learning more material. And that led us to investigate grades. And so again, we saw that controlling for a whole variety of factors that Heather could help to elaborate on later, we saw that there was a difference in sort of course grade, which was mostly not based on scientist spotlights. It was mostly based on evaluatively graded material that related to course content between these two sort of treatment groups. And so implying that perhaps there was indeed more science learning, controlling as much as possible for other factors, based perhaps on doing these assignments that had these biographical connections and reflective prompts related to scientists. So I think that's the end of my bit of an intro. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we can go back to our regular view. But I think I'll hand it back to you, Erin.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction and the summary of the study. And please, I'm already seeing some questions. Great. Please go ahead and use that Q&A function to ask questions. And I will sort of synthesize questions and steer some towards Jeff as we go, and also to make sure that Heather has a chance to chime in. So you mentioned that you got started in this by just trying a scientist spotlight in the classroom, and you got really overwhelmingly positive response from students. Can you talk a little bit about that positive response? What did that look like? Because I think that sometimes, at least I struggle with thinking about how do I represent identity in the classroom and how do I navigate the challenges regarding having a conversation about that?
Yeah, I think that a couple things really stood out to me was that it was mostly, if I could summarize sort of like the emotional impact of what I was seeing was largely like, I had no idea that folks like this were in science, and that that it's just amazing to see this, and I'm so inspired, and I can't believe it, and this person seems just like me, and I had no idea that there'd be somebody just like me. And so there are a lot of quotes, again, that you can find in the paper that I think kind of reflect some of what we saw there, and so you get a feel for what the actual student quotes were like. But I was kind of almost jumped out of my chair at just how across the board, it was, again, just one, and this is just one done on Lawrence David, that was the first one that I tried, of how many people who, we're not just Filipino-American students, or we're not just people who are interested in microbiology or something, but people who are relating to him on so many levels, and just totally shocked and totally amazed that somebody like him existed out there. And so I think that it really showed how we often do not humanize people in science. And so, like, there's all these axes of diversity we could talk about that are featured perhaps in scientist spotlights, but really just the humanizing of scientists was kind of a really big deal in general that really impacted all students. And so I think that it just, for me, it was so surprising that, like, I did not realize that the stereotypes were so strong. I mean, you kind of, it almost seems cliche now, like, oh yeah, like the lab coat wearing, crazy haired professor who's the scientist, and like you almost feel like that's passé, or that doesn't exist. It's not. Like the stereotypes are still extremely strong, and I think that I just didn't anticipate how strong they were. And that was what I saw in the responses, that like that was really affirming to me, like these are really strong stereotypes. Students are still believing them, and they're still resonating with those stereotypes. And that an attempt to show anything that's different from that is really quite shocking to students.
Wow, that's amazing. So we actually have questions from the field that I'm going to start putting out there. So one question actually brings up the idea of instructor talk, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what you might be thinking about instructor talk, and if the scientist spotlights, the way that you implemented them or the way that you worked with the comparison group that didn't have exposure to the scientist spotlights might have experienced instructor talk, and whether that was a factor.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that that's something I've thought about a lot, and that has become really interesting as more and more people across the country have started using scientist spotlights and not necessarily using my same instructor talk, I think. And so, and I think that one could easily make an argument that, like, well, you know, clearly, Jeff, you're saying things in class that is part of the intervention as well, and that maybe saying those things could be done without scientist spotlight intervention and still have a lot of impact. And I would predict that's probably true, that you probably could have some impact based on instructor talk. I think that I'll say that my instructor...
Explain a little bit about what you think of when you think of instructor talk, because everyone might not be familiar with that.
Exactly. Yeah, so instructor talk is something that my colleagues and I have studied in sort of a different strand of our research, which is when you take, for example, a transcript of a class or an entire course or an entire semester, and you take that transcript and you delete anything from it that's related to content. So you're deleting all the discussion of mitosis or of bone physiology or whatever it is, and you're seeing what is left. And it is quite fascinating what is left, actually, and terrifying sometimes to look at your own, or just really eye-opening. But we predict, I think, the folks who are studying this, that those sort of non-content language has a lot to do with sort of students' experiences in a class, and perhaps, again, how much they learn and sort of how much they engage with the course based on the way that that language sets up a sense of community across the classroom, or, you know, sort of discusses how science is done and sort of relates to the process of science, or all these different sort of characteristics. And so one of the things that instructor talk does is sets up activities as well, and sort of explains the rationale for activities, or explains, like, you know, some of the stuff about like how science is done and who does science. And so I think that it's natural that in doing a scientist spotlight, there has to be some instructor talk about, like, well, why are we doing this? I mean, either it's like, you know, this thing is due Monday, do it. That's one version of instructor talk, or there's something more elaborate about why it's happening. And then in addition about, like, you know, when it's, after it's done, like maybe there's some discussion in class or more instructor talk about what actually resulted from that assignment or something. And I'll say what's interesting is that my instructor talk around scientist spotlights shifts a lot. I feel like it shifts a lot from quarter to quarter. We're in the quarter system, from class to class, and just based on what I'm seeing in the responses. And so I'm not sure that I've had one way of discussing this. And there's times where my instructor talk of setting up these assignments or reflecting on them in class afterwards is very much more explicit about equity and social justice and race and privilege. And there's other times when it's not, and maybe I'm just feeling the room or something, or maybe I'm just reacting to what I see in the responses, but it does shift a lot. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's not something we tried to quantify in our study, so I'm not sure that we can address that. I mean, one thing that I think is really intriguing to me is seeing, for example, I can just say, you know, these aren't published studies, but anecdotally, like we've had a high school instructor in a public school in San Francisco basically replicate our study with her students and basically get the same results. Okay. Recently, somebody at University of Minnesota, R1 institution, predominantly white institution, so very different from my community college, also basically replicated the study and found very similar results. And with neither of those folks did I ever have a conversation with them about instructor talk. And they're both, I think, I would just say, very different instructors than me. And so it leads me to think that there's a very important element of instructor talk and how it's framed in a classroom, but that perhaps there's something about the structure of the assignment that if you apply the assignment and you have the reflective prompts, that will get you some sort of results as well, regardless of the type of instructor talk.
Great. Thank you for that question, Christopher. And actually, you touched on two ideas that Rita has brought up. One is, can you clarify the two different treatments? So what was the scientist spotlight treatment and what was the non-treatment? And then Rita also asked about your opportunities to evaluate whether different faculty have implemented and had the same effect. So maybe you can sort of touch back on that since you brought that up.
Yeah, so the two treatments were same course, same instructors. We've added more courses now too, so there's more data now, but at what we published on was the same biology course, the general education course in human biology, same instructor, same curriculum, same activities in class, same tests, same quiz questions, same lab activities, all that kind of stuff. Obviously different groups of students on potentially different days, like Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday, or those kinds of things, and slightly different demographics as tends to happen, and Heather could talk about how we tried to deal with those issues. the only difference was, and so they all had homework assignments too. The only difference was the homework assignments for the control students did not have the biographical piece. So if you go back to that Lawrence David example, there's this like hefty biographical piece where there's like a little bit of introduction on him, and then there was a podcast they listened to where he was talking. But then there's a Nature article that sort of led us into the content that week. So the control class, they would have gotten the Nature article along with some reflective prompts that were very similar. Like what's most interesting, what's most confusing, what questions do you have? So very similar reflective prompts, but just not having the biographical piece there was really the only difference between those courses in terms of how the course structure was set up. And then, yeah, with the other results, so yeah, I don't know how much I would want to elaborate on that, but like, the high school instructor basically did a complete replication study. She didn't use quite as many. I think she did 3 sets of scientists, or no, 4 or 5. It was like 4 or 5 sets of scientist spotlights over a semester, but she used the exact same reflection prompts, pre and post assessments, and basically made graphs that look very almost identical to ours in this paper that we're all talking about today. And then the University of Minnesota one was a bit different. It was a bit of a different type of class, and I think they structured the assignments a little bit differently, but they still had the same sort of reflective prompts, and they still looked at the same kind of pre-post sort of data, and again found these shifts going on in stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So a couple of folks have asked questions related to how you went about developing the scientist spotlights. How do you identify scientists? How did you put them together? And whether there's a database that people could use. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So I think that I went about developing, so I did that first, again, Lawrence David one, and then that so struck me that summer, I just decided, like, my students inspired me, honestly. Like, my students pushed me to do this, which I think we could talk about that too, because I think an interesting subtle intervention is not just on the students, but on the instructor. I think that I felt so empowered to be more overt and address issues of equity and inclusion and social justice in class based on my students giving me license to do that. And I think that I've seen that in other instructors who've tried that they get that enthusiasm from students, and that pushes them to do more. But for me, it pushed me for that summer to say, like, okay, I want to do this every week. This is going to be my weekly homework assignment, to introduce the content. And so that summer, I looked at my course calendar, and so part of how I developed them was looking at the content, like what would we typically be studying the next week, and how can I develop an assignment that really supplements that and that students will see is relevant to their work. Because so again, making the diversity inclusion not feel extra, but actually integrated into the curriculum. And then I think that I really tried to look at my students and think about who they were, what I knew about them at least, and try to think about the axes of diversity that I could highlight that might relate to them. And it really became a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, because I really, really, really wanted to try to highlight as many axes of diversity as possible, especially those relevant to my students. And so it got to the end where I'm like looking for this specific type of person to feature who happens to study, muscles or something, I don't know. And so it got a bit difficult in that sense, but that was sort of the other thing that I looked at. And I think, we could talk about this later too, but I think that's really important. And obviously we want to show a diversity of folks. I've more and more seen that it's really the humanizing of scientists that's important, and that actually people will stretch to relate to lots of different kinds of scientists that don't necessarily match their specific, aspect of diversity. And then in terms of a database, yeah, so there's a week has not gone by since the paper was published that someone was asking, where do I find these? And so Heather, actually, could you talk a little bit about the exciting news about that, or what the progress is there?
Sure. So I'm at NC State, and we have a distance education program that's been around for a while, since the 90s, and they offer grants to faculty and grad students like me who are interested in either developing a version of a course that's taught in person to be done over DE, or for tools to be used in the classroom, sort of electronic tools. And so I did receive a grant, and that also includes assistance from the tech people and the art people in that department to create a Scientist Spotlights database. We're currently working on that. We're in the wireframe stage, so they haven't started coding it, but we're right about to. And so we're hoping to have a prototype up by the end of this semester, before the summer, hopefully. Part of what we've done, just to keep it a little more feasible, is to focus just on psychology. Since we are a psychology department, I'm using the spotlights in my class, and some of the other graduate student PIs are. But the actual website itself will just be a place where people can submit basically anything. So it'll be kind of like a wiki or something like that you could set up on your own. And so we're hoping to create that and then to give that to Jeff so that he could use it either for biology or for more STEM broadly. And yeah, so that's where we are with that one.
So there's a question specifically speaking to the axes of diversity that you touched on. Is there any, are there any scientists who represent sort of different career paths, like industry or policy or government, that you're representing in this group of spotlights?
Yeah, I feel like a broader question that this has brought up for a lot of people is like, well, who do we call a scientist?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that that's a really interesting discussion to have. And like, you know, because I mean, I tend to be inclusive with that definition, I think, myself, but I think that people have cautioned about like, well, to what extent then is it just my 3-year-old is a scientist? Because everybody's a scientist. And I'm like, well, I don't think I could do a scientist spotlight on my 3-year-old as much as I think that'd be pretty fun. But and so I think that like obviously there's a point at which like, you know, maybe, you know, who we hold up as an example of a scientist becomes less helpful. But I think that it could be inclusive of a lot of folks. And so like people say like doctors, like at what point is a doctor a scientist? Like are they, you know, doing research at the same time, or like what does that mean? But I have featured folks at both of different career types and also at different stages of the academic sort of pathway. And so, like, for example, I've featured somebody who does not do research at all, but is really involved in sort of, I guess, like, you know, crowdsourcing science and sort of, you know, community engagement with science. And so she studied science and, you know, got a PhD, I think, but now is not working in a lab environment, is instead working with like engaging the public in science. And so that's, you know, that's an example of somebody else. And then I found in terms of like career stages, like students really love hearing about people like grad students. And so like, you know, there's a grad student I'm featuring in my current course who's, she's even local. She's at Stanford, which is not too far from my institution here. And people just love hearing about her because she seems much more like a near peer, sort of more proximal example. And so I think like featuring grad students, postdocs as well is a really great thing. But yeah, and I don't have an answer to like what types of scientists we should and shouldn't feature. I think that it sort of depends on the goals of the instructor and the goals of the course. I mean, I think I'll also say, I think something else that comes up that I think is intriguing, and Heather and I have talked a bit about this, is that I don't think that I see this intervention as necessarily trying to get everybody to be a scientist. Like, I mean, I think that if you want to be a scientist, that should be a career track open to you, and that you should feel like you have a sense of belonging there, and that maybe some other people who you relate to have been there before, so you see your, you know, future possible self there or something. But I don't necessarily have the goal that I want every single one of my students to be a scientist. I'm not sure that that's serving them well. And so at the same time, though, I do want them to all be able to engage with science. And so I want them to feel like that they have a connection to science, they have a connection to scientists, and that scientists are people like them. So that when they're at the voting booth, or when they're making health decisions, or when they're treating patients, or whatever it might be, that they feel comfortable addressing things through sort of an evidence-based lens and using scientific practices and engaging with science. And so in that sense, maybe it is actually very helpful to feature folks who are not just traditional researchers.
Absolutely. That's great. So several folks are asking questions related to how the students engage with the spotlights. So first of all, for example, do all of them have a component where they can actually listen to the scientist talk, or do some of them just have written components? And then have you involved students at all in actually creating spotlights or reaching out to the scientists who are featured in the spotlights?
Yeah, so I think that the examples that we currently have are a variety of range of things. And I mean, Heather could speak to ones that she's used to, because she's adapted these to her classes in various ways, in very analogous ways. But I really love Story Collider, and so that example from Lawrence David, they're one of my partners now, so we work with Story Collider in this project.
Can you explain a little bit about what Story Collider is, just in case people aren't familiar?
Yeah, so it's Story Collider, like an atom collider or something, COLLIDER.org. And they're a group that is run by Liz Neely, who's like very prominent in the science communication sort of realm. And they do live shows where they have sort of speaking events and have people, you know, telling their stories. They do sort of workshops for scientists to help scientists become good storytellers. And then the shows that they record the shows, and then they become, you know, these podcasts that they post online. And they now have hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of podcasts. And they really do make a very explicit effort to feature diversity in science. And they're all the podcasts, because they've been received some training in speaking and sort of crafting their story. They're all either very funny, like Lawrence David is just like hilarious. He's a very funny person to listen to, or heart-wrenching, or really, really fascinating. And so they're really, I think, intriguing stories. Most of them now do come with a transcript, so they're more accessible as well. And even sort of searchable, like they're working on their tags in their search engine, but you can kind of search them for topics. So you could put in cancer or something if you're studying cancer or mitosis or whatever, and find some cancer podcasts. But they're almost all scientists telling the stories, and so it's a great source to find scientists to feature. And then the nice thing is, if you find a really intriguing scientist to feature who relates to your content, then you can go and like look up one of their academic articles, and then you have that content connection to add in. And so now you found like the full sort of thing there. And I've used TED Talks and other things too, but I also have plenty of spotlights that are just written interviews or something, or that are news articles where it's like sort of a biographical news article about somebody. So I've used those as well, and I don't necessarily have evidence right now about which ones are more effective. Like if like having a multimedia element is more effective or not, I don't know. I do think it's awfully cool to hear from a scientist in their own voice. I think that's really nice, because just the inflection and the way they sound is really, I think, impactful for some students, but I don't necessarily know the outcomes of that. And then in terms of the second question, so like sometimes it goes the opposite way for me, or like I find an article that I think is really fascinating and really intriguing to use, and then I just will reach out to the scientist after that because I can't find biographical information on them. And so like I'll just do an email interview or a phone interview with them. And by and large, people love to tell their story, right? And so people are flattered and really excited to tell a little bit about themselves. And so I think I've yet to encounter somebody who's like, no, I won't tell you my story. And then I'll create like I'll either record it and then actually post that for students, or I'll create sort of a written summary of my discussion with that person, and then have that as the biographical piece. And yeah, so like this website, this database that Heather and NC State is helping us to develop is part of a larger National Institutes of Health project now that is funded to develop that database, but also to develop lots more spotlights to put in that database.
Cool.
And with my collaborator, Kimberly Tanner, we're trying to really empower students to lead that effort. So like, I don't see why, I said I went away that summer and I tried to create this, impossible chart to like find out who I should feature. But I'm not sure that I should be the one deciding who to feature in class, right? And so we're trying to empower students through service learning, students in biology and health science or whatever, to learn about STEM equity and sort of some of these issues of stereotype threat, and then through service learning course as a capstone sort of project to create scientist spotlights in partnership with a teacher or faculty member, so that they get that content connection, because the student may not know that content connection that well, but so they get the content connection, but then the student has all the control over who gets featured and how they get featured. And in piloting this, we've had students do the same thing I did, which is reach out and interview scientists. And it's been fascinating there. Like, so you get this back end effect on the service learning student where like, it's very impactful for them to reach out to a scientist who they just email and they never expect to write them back, and then to actually talk to them on the phone and interview them. And so we're finding that these service learning students have their own huge shifts in science identity, I think, because they feel empowered to like go out and like really talk to other scientists and interview them, and then present those folks to other students like themselves.
Wow. I wanted to chime in on that one. Yeah. So I have a collaborator who was inspired by the scientist spotlights. I don't know if anybody remembers the VH1 show, Where Are They Now? Where it'd be like child stars and where they ended up. And so we have in psychology a lot of landmark studies like Milgram or the Stanford study. And then like, there's these populations now, and so we're now so much more the way that we've been identifying people to profile and getting the students involved in finding people.
So folks are asking questions actually about your student population, and maybe we can address two questions related to that. So one is, how did you decide which groups of students to have in the non-spotlight group and which groups of students you decided to have in the spotlight group? And then also whether you think that that maybe different populations of students that maybe not like your populations of students, for example, in rural Georgia, where I live, would you expect similar kinds of effects, or how much do you think of it as contextual?
Yeah, absolutely. And I might have Heather weigh in on that second question, since she works at a very different institution, I think, demographically than I do as well. But yes, and sorry, what was the first question again? I forgot.
So the first question is, tell a little bit about your student demographics, and then how you decided who was in which group.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so my students are come from very diverse populations, no matter how you sort of think about diversity. I think that, so just some of the more typical statistics, it's about 20% folks that I would identify as white, and so 80% non-white. And that includes about, I don't have the statistics right in front of me right now, but I think it's about like in the high 30s or 40% Asian individuals, which includes a large proportion of Southeast Asian folks who are, you know, traditionally underserved in sciences. And then about 20% Latino, 25% Latino, somewhere around there. And then a variety of others, a lot of Pacific Islander students, Filipino and Pacific Islander students. And my students are majority identify as women, but there's always a couple few folks who identify as transgender individuals in class. I serve quite a lot of veterans. So the school I'm at now actually has quite a lot of veteran population here. Age is like all over the place. And so we do not have, you know, sort of the typical freshman age. That's pretty rare. We have maybe some 18-year-olds, but they're mostly older. It's mostly in their 20s, but we have folks up into their 50s and 60s regularly in every single class. Academic backgrounds are all over the place. And so folks who have literally never taken a science class in their lives, and so someone maybe coming from a different country where they just didn't have a science class, or somehow slipped through the cracks and did not get a science class, even in junior high and high school here in the United States. Two folks who, you know, I have folks right now in my class who have masters and PhDs in science fields, and they're sitting right next to each other in the same course. And so really quite diverse experiences in terms of backgrounds, folks who have housing insecurity, food insecurity, all that kind of stuff. So phenomenal students, best students in the world, I'll tell you all the time. They're the best. But and yeah, and then in terms of who was in what treatment, I think there wasn't a lot of forethought. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, I would often have a Monday, Wednesday class and a Tuesday, Thursday class, for example. And so like one group would be in the control treatment and one group would be in the scientist spotlight group. And whether one was Monday, Wednesday, one was Tuesday, Thursday, I'm not sure that there was much of a difference there. But yeah, Heather, do you want to say anything about like how people respond to these types of assignments in an institution that is not the same demographics as mine?
Yep, so I'm at NC State. We're a PWI. We're a big state school. I think our student population is like 40,000 undergrad. We've got about a little over half that in graduate students. We are an R1, so we're definitely focused a lot on research. We are a land grant institution, so we have a big engineering program, a big agricultural program, a veterinary medicine, so we have a strong STEM focus at the school. In psychology, we have an interesting issue with diversity. So psychology in the past was very dominated by white men, and at the moment it's very dominated by white women. In terms of sort of the junior faculty in our student population, I'm teaching a research methods class now with 150 students, and I think almost 100 of them, of that 150, are white women who are interested in being clinicians or practitioners or therapists. So it's an interesting challenge talking about diversity in that context. Overall, I think the thing that's been really how students have responded to it has been just sort of demystifying research. We talk constantly about research and studies in psychology, and we're just throwing all these findings, and we rarely ever get into sort of how we do that. And so demystifying that, I think, has, and especially in a research methods context, because everybody hates the research methods class. It's been really good for getting people engaged with that and thinking of psychologists as scientists.
Nice.
Yeah, and I might just add as well, I mean, I think that Heather kind of touches on a point, which is that one thing that I've always emphasized maybe in my instructor talk is that, you know, if you're required to write 250 words, 350 words on the Spotlight assignment, you can spend those words however you want. And so, like, you know, the assignments typically have these 4 prompts, and one of them is very specifically about who does science. And many students they're so intrigued by that they spend their entire 300 words or whatever talking about that, and that's great. But I very much openly tell students, like, you know, if this is a way to give people multiple avenues and multiple access points for the content, right? And so you should, you know, use these in whatever way is most helpful to you to access and sort of engage with this content. And so I think that the fact that there is this research piece there, like Heather said, and that like you could write 300 words just about the research, I think that makes for a safe space where if somebody is not quite ready or not quite, you know, open yet to being so explicitly talking about diversity and inclusion and equity in like a response that they don't feel forced to. It doesn't feel like a forced diversity activity for somebody who's just really kind of getting their feet wet as a student, or really is not sure if what their place is in equity and inclusion yet. And so I think that like that is nice, and that like for a lot of populations it can feel comfortable no matter where you're kind of coming at it from, whether that's like, you know, oh my gosh, I'm a social justice like huge advocate, and like I'm gonna, you know, really take this view on this as a student, versus, you know, like, oh wow, like I'm looking at a research article or a popular press article maybe even about a research study, and I can really kind of think about the course content we're studying and write about that if that's where my comfort zone is.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have a few questions actually about other outcomes for students. I mean, you looked at sort of espousing stereotype versus non-stereotypical views, but we have a couple of questions related to, for example, if students explored different career paths as a result, or were they interested in then actually trying some science as citizen scientists? So maybe you can comment a little bit on other outcomes that you observed or got some insight into.
Yeah, totally. And so I think that anecdotally, we've seen, yeah, all of those things happen. And so, in fact, just this morning, I got an email from a student from last quarter who said, like, you know, like very explicitly, like, wow, like studying all that science last quarter with those scientist spotlights we did really made me curious about grad school, which wasn't something I was considering before. Because this is in a allied health course, anatomy and physiology course. And so folks who are not typically going to grad school or research careers going instead to, you know, nursing or radiology technician or physical education or whatever. And so it's really quite common that at least a handful of students in every single class, you know, comes up and says like, you know, oh, wow, well, what is this thing? And what is this grad school? Because I mean, at least amongst my students, this is maybe different in a place like NC State, but like my students have never, like grad school is so far off their radar. They don't know that it exists. Yeah. And much less do they know that it's generally free or you get paid. And so like, you know, they're all thinking about going into nursing or something where you're, you know, even in the best of situations, you're paying a decent amount of money for that education. And so, I mean, like, that's part of my instructor talk too. Usually somewhere during the class, I try to say like, just so you know, like you get paid to go to grad school. And there's a point where some people's brains start exploding at that point because they just can't conceive of that. So there's always a handful of folks at least who approach me and say like, well, can you tell me more about that? And it's nice because now being so close to Stanford, which, you know, to their credit is really, really interested in diversifying their biosciences graduate program. You know, I have connections now where I can say like, okay, you know, go talk to this recruiter over there at Stanford, and they'll talk to you. Like, we have some, you know, partnerships set up with the grad students there who we know are good mentors or maybe have, you know, similar backgrounds or interests as my students, and we know are not just going to say, grad school is horrible, never come, like, you know, because some people are a little bit too in the middle of it. Yeah. And they can't quite get out of it. So we know that they'll be supportive.
They're in their fourth year.
Yeah. Like they'll be honest. They won't hide that it's hard, but they also won't. They'll recognize there's a reason they're still there. Like they're still in grad school, and so that's been really fun. And so, like I said, I just got an email yesterday from another person just like that. Yeah, and so like that citizen science example, for example, like I've certainly had people who are like, oh wow, like once I saw that, I totally signed up for like to participate.
Oh, cool
stuff. And yeah, so I think that we've certainly anecdotally seen that. We've, you know, in the study, I think we do talk about that we see STEM career interest go up if you change your stereotypes. And so we do have that data point. Mm-hmm. We do not have any sort of longitudinal like tracking of these students to see like, did they actually go into science, or like, how are they engaging with science now? You know, obviously that'd be fantastic. It's difficult to do in any situation. It's maybe even especially difficult to do in the community college situation where the population is so fluid and people are coming and going and leaving the country and coming back to the country and all these kinds of things. But yes, I don't think we can really say anything quantitative or, you know, about that.
Sure, but interesting avenues for future exploration.
Yeah.
So we have a question related to impacts on instructors who do this. So, I mean, you obviously can talk about your own experience, and I think the group would love to hear that. But I also wonder, you could imagine that an instructor might do this because they already have really strong beliefs about scientists being all sorts of people. But it also might be that they change their beliefs in the course of teaching the scientist spotlight. So can you comment a little bit on the influence on you as an instructor of this experience, and whether you've heard from other instructors who are teaching with the spotlights and how it's changed them, sort of provided that two-way street?
Yeah, I mean, I think we briefly mentioned this in the paper, though we don't spend a lot of time on it. But to me, this intervention is just as much for the instructor as it is for the student, because I think it can be really career changing and life changing for an instructor. I think that the sort of, I might want to say sneaky thing about it, but like whatever, is that like it can feel very comfortable because it's part of the curriculum. It's like, well, okay, why wouldn't I have my students like read a scientific article? And so like I hear that a lot, right? Like people are like, well, even more traditional faculty, right? It's like, well, why wouldn't I do it? Seems fine to me. Like it's like takes no time. And it's like, kind of the more the deficit side of like, doing extra stuff.
Why not? Yeah.
Like, why not? Which, maybe again is maybe not the highest of reasons to do something, but I'll take it.
Yeah, that might get them started, right?
Yeah. And so people say like, oh, well, sure, I'll throw it in. I mean, who cares? Like, well, I'll try it. But of course, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, well, yeah, just wait until you get the responses, like, because then you're going to shift your ideas. And I've seen that happen over and over, where like, and this is another type of email that I get regularly, maybe not once a week, but still quite regularly ever since the paper came out. Is like, oh my gosh, I tried one in class and you wouldn't believe what my students said. And then oftentimes they're like copying and pasting like student quotes, like anonymous student quotes below that. Like they said this and this and this, and like, I can't believe it. And so I think that for faculty who maybe have not had the benefit of getting a lot of training in equity and inclusion and how to incorporate social justice into the science classroom, having your students tell you that it's okay to do that and that they appreciate it is really empowering, and will really get people to become more social justice pioneers in their classes, I think. And I've absolutely seen that happen amongst folks. And so as somebody who does a lot of professional development with faculty, I see Scientist Spotlights as professional development for faculty. Is like, just try one of these with your students, just give it a try. Because I know enough now after the years that the article has been out that they're pretty sure to get some pretty good quotes from students, and then that will empower them to do much, much more in the way of equity and inclusion.
That's really lovely. So in your comments about instructors, you're sort of getting at an interesting idea about how this is working, because it could be that the Scientist Spotlights are simply, examples of role models is an idea you mentioned, or the possible selves is an idea you mentioned. But we have a question that really asks about what are the parts that make it work? So is it the reflection piece? Is it that there's the humanizing piece? Is it that, that you're really changing how the instructor thinks about what they're doing in the classroom every day? So I don't know if you can comment on any of that. And if you haven't worked on that at all, what might be the next steps to try and address that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have the direct evidence of that. It's sort of in some ways like the instructor talk, like, where we suspect that, how these are discussed probably has some impact, but we're not sure to what extent and why or what impacts. I think that we hypothesize a couple things that we bring up in the discussion of the paper, which I feel fairly confident have something to do with the impacts. And one is the integration with curriculum. So that's kind of why I highlighted that in the example that we looked at earlier. That again, seeing this as something that is part of what we study in science, and that that we should know about who's doing the science and who's asking the questions and why they ask those questions, because there's a lot of questions that don't get asked in science, and who asks those questions has a lot to do with what we do and don't know about our fields, and who, what therapies we have and don't have, or what solutions to the problems in the world we have and don't have is based on who answers those questions. And so really showcasing that it's important to know who's asking the question as part of our curriculum, and that can drive some of what we do in class, I think is very impactful, as opposed to, again, just like an extra thing. Like you think of like a box out section in a textbook or something, like focus on diversity, and that's like over to the side and has nothing really to do with what's being, learned or what's being tested or what's being assessed in class or something. And so I think like that integration is important. And then I think that we also feel like that reflection prompt of like, well, what does this tell you about the types of people that do science? And so I think we mentioned in the paper that even in the control class, like there were a few sort of like the more traditional example, like I said, of like having like an example of a scientist shown of like, oh, we're studying, this aspect of cell biology or this organelle right now. Like, oh, by the way, like here's like this really interesting scientist who studied it, and like even like a short YouTube clip to intro it, like just as an engagement into getting into that. Like you're like, let's listen to this, African-American scientists tell us a little bit about what they studied and why they do that and how remarkable they are. And then mostly move on after that. And in the control classes, we really did not see anything in the way of shifts in scientist stereotypes because of that. And so I think that like that was really helpful to show. I mean, in a way it could have messed up our study, right? That there was sort of this extra intervention happening in the control classes, but I think, and again, I hypothesize because there was no reflection activity after that. Like there was not something we never asked like, what did that tell you about the types of people that do science? Like write about that or talk with a neighbor or something. And so you wonder, as an intermediate sort of type of intervention, like what if we'd added that, right? And so like I do feel like that aspect of reflection of like, what is this telling you, was probably a key piece of it. And so so it's funny, like we often see like somebody will say like, oh, I'm thinking of doing the scientist spotlight, and somehow it will lack that prompt. And I think a lot of things we're often doing is saying, hey, you don't do whatever you want. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. But you might want to add in this prompt. And so that actually happened with a colleague recently, where she added in the prompt to subsequent spotlights. And it was again one of these situations where she was just like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe, like, it really inspired a lot of different types of discussion just to have that prompt there to like think about what types of people that do science.
Nice. So I wanted to get at the sort of next steps for research, but I want to ask you one follow-up question that relates to some of the questions we're getting about that is, if an instructor wants to get started doing this, so they should definitely include that prompt. So what does this make you think about the kinds of people that do science? Are there any other sort of how-to advice pieces that you could offer if somebody wants to just get started doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that including that prompt, I would recommend. And then I think just thinking about how you can make it clear that it's not something extra. I think that one of the things that people have asked me about in the past is, what about student resistance or something? Or, what about, it kind of came up in like terms of other populations of students. If you're serving maybe a predominantly white group of students or something, like, do they see this as somehow threatening, or do they see this as something that they don't feel like they have a right to engage with or something? And so I think that there's ways around all those problems, of course, but one of the easiest structural ways around that is just to show that it's connected to the curriculum. And so that if, one question that I ask often is of other instructors is like, okay, regardless of the biographical piece, because that's going to be awesome, but like this sort of content piece, is that a reading you would give in a typical class? Like, would you, like, yes or no, like, would you typically have your students read this, whether it's a scientific article or an animation? I'm sometimes a cool, like, content-related animation related to that scientist's work or whatever. But whatever the content piece is this something you would show to students normally? And if not, then we're getting into kind of that like extra space. Like that's like, well, maybe students will not see that connection because you don't see that connection, right? Mm-hmm. So I think asking yourself that question is like, is this sort of, content, a type of homework assignment or reading or in class, whatever it might be, is this something I would normally give to students? And if the answer is yes, then I think students will see that connection and they'll see that like, wow, this is really integrated into our course.
Got it.
And so I think that's one of the other pieces of advice I give people, is to answer that question for yourself.
That's nice. That's helpful, because it does make it more an integral part of the course as opposed to that diversity box on the side.
Right.
So getting at next steps for research. Are you trying to pull apart the pieces, or maybe you could talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
so I think I'll have Heather mostly chime in. She's actually, we had a chapter in a book, an American Chemical Society book that we published last year, I think, Heather, right? And then she's done a couple posters on some other stuff, because we've been experimenting with quantitative surveys to try to get at this, just because we know that in some senses that's more practical for folks. If we want to bring more people in and really have more large-scale research on this, having a quantitative set of survey items would be helpful. And then we've looked at analyzing the stuff in different ways. So Heather, do you want to say a few words about like some of the stuff, like the posters and other stuff that you've been working on that showed different stuff and different activities?
Yes, so we've been collecting data. So at the same time that we were writing this paper, we were also using more quantitative measures to see if we could get at the same thing that we saw with the qualitative prompts in a way that's easier to measure with a large population. So some of the additional, and getting at the question about like mechanisms and what's causing the change. We were looking also at sort of beliefs about critical vision, which is beliefs about equality in science. So what perceptions people have of that, barriers and attitudes towards schooling, stereotypes of scientists. My advisor has a stereotypes of scientists scale that we're using. Also looking at like growth mindset, so whether growth versus fixed, and self-efficacy, and just sort of confidence in science and the ability to excel in the class. So we are looking at a lot of those things, and that is data that I'm still analyzing. It's unfortunately stuck behind my trying to get out of grad school thing, but it's going. So we have a lot of data on that. I've also been interested in looking at sort of how we conceptualize of what a stereotype is, how we recognize when somebody is engaging in a stereotypical sort of pattern of thinking. And it's a bit trickier than it kind of sounds. You can always ask somebody, do you think you're being stereotypical, or do you think you have stereotypical thoughts about things? And they'll probably say yes, because they've been sort of coached in this idea that we all have implicit biases. But really getting at how that's changing is something that I'm still struggling with. We did some confirmatory factor analysis in the book chapter that Jeff mentioned that was looking at the group level, how stereotypes and conceptualizations of scientists change after being exposed to the intervention, specifically that it had less of a clear factor structure, so it was disrupted. And I'm taking that as an argument that there's less stereotypes because there's less structure and less rigidity, but that is sort of an out there-ish argument, so it's not necessarily something that has a lot of support in the field. But yeah, that is something else we're looking at.
Great, thank you.